Here's the headline. Russia vows response if U.S. puts longer range missiles in Germany. And this is an announcement that was made at the NATO summit between the U.S. and Germany that they will be putting these long range missiles in Germany. And they can do this because of the U.S. withdrawal from the INF Treaty, which Trump withdrew from in 2019. And Democrats ignored because that undermined their conspiracy theory that Trump was really doing Russia's bidding. And Russia, ever since Trump did this, has been saying, let's have a moratorium on the development of these long range missiles. And Russia has actually kept to that commitment of a moratorium on the deployment. But unfortunately now recently, because of years of U.S. ignoring Russia and refusing to renegotiate and Biden came into office, rather than saying Trump made a big mistake, let's renegotiate that treaty, let's get back into it, Biden continued the U.S. policy. So let's just go through the history here because it's really instructive. You've had for years and years and years, Russia warning, like begging the U.S. to please, let's put a stop to this insanity, because the INF Treaty, what it did was it eliminated an entire class of nuclear weapons, thousands of them, and took them offline. And it was
which can fire over a range of 600 to 800 miles.
Yeah,
which is insane.
So I'll just take everybody briefly through the history here of the U.S. withdrawing and then Russia begging the U.S. to reconsider. Okay, so this is August 2019. Here's the announcement from Donald Trump that the U.S. is pulling out. U.S. pulls out of Cold War era pact with Russia, the INF Treaty. That's August 2019. Okay, and again, this was totally ignored in the U.S. because that was the peak of Russiagate. The announcement that the U.S. would do this was actually made earlier. It was made in 2018, which was the peak of Russiagate. And then finally, the actual withdrawal was formalized in August 2019. That's when the withdrawal happened. But the announcement was made the previous year, which was just totally downplayed because everybody was more concerned with believing that Trump was really a Russian agent and following the twists and turns of the Mueller investigations. Okay, so August 2019, the U.S. pulls out formally from the INF. Okay, the next month, September 2019, Putin sends NATO proposal for moratorium on missile deployment to Europe. So Russia was saying, okay, we know you've just killed this treaty, but let's still observe its provisions and let's have a moratorium on missile deployment to Europe. U.S. ignored that and actually started immediately testing the very weapons that were previously banned under the INF Treaty. Okay, so that's September 2019. Fast forward to November 2020, Russia actually expanded the proposal, said let's actually have a wider moratorium on INF range missiles. That's November 2020. The U.S. again ignores it. Okay, moving on to December 2021. Okay, another Russian warning. This is what Russia says. Russia says it may be forced to deploy mid-range nuclear missiles in Europe. Again, saying to the U.S., unless you revisit your decision to kill the INF Treaty, we're going to have to deploy these missiles in Europe. And this goes on and on and on. So up
referring to Belarus.
Yeah. And so up until recently, Russia was observing this moratorium. Finally, last month, June 2024, after years of Russia begging the U.S. to re-enter the INF Treaty, or at least respect its provisions, finally Putin said, we're going to have to redeploy because the U.S. is ignoring us and they're deploying missiles to the Philippines. And now the U.S. has just said we're going to deploy them even more dangerously to Germany. And this has gotten a complete yawn in the U.S. People in the media class don't care that the U.S. is basically returning to the Cold War and flagrantly violating one of its most important treaties.
Which would mean nuclear brinksmanship in the heart of Europe for the first time since the Cold War.
Yeah.
And I think they justified, the people who were pulling Trump's strings in 2019 justified this all based on Russia's testing of intermediate nuclear missiles, while Russia was clamoring for a new deal.
They claimed that Russia was in violation of the INF Treaty, and there would have been a really easy way to check, which is just go through the mechanisms that the INF Treaty established to enforce it, right? But the U.S. didn't want to do that because they actually knew that what they were saying was false. Ted Postal, a former Pentagon advisor, professor at MIT, he's written about how Russia was not in violation. And if there was any confusion, it could have been worked out just by following the INF provisions and using the mechanisms that exist to resolve disputes. But Trump's administration didn't want to do that because they wanted an excuse to deploy these missiles. And their aim, again, and going back to the beginning where we talked about the NATO summit coming out really forcefully with all these statements against China, the Trump administration's aim was they wanted to be able to threaten these weapons at China as well, because China has been developing its own missiles. So that was the real agenda there. But everybody ignores it because we're supposed to just think the Cold War militarism, the same thing that millions of people rallied against in the 1980s, which helped produce these arms control treaties that the U.S. has now pulled out of. We're supposed to believe that that's the way we should be conducting foreign policy, as we just saw from that unhinged Biden campaign ad, which liberals have completely been enlisted in because of years and years of Russiagate propaganda.
And we have major profits in abandoning the INF to be reaped. There are bondholders and shareholders who hold close to $330 billion in nuclear weapon producing companies, specifically Northrop Grumman and General Dynamics. Those are the two top producers. And those shareholders and bondholders are the usual suspects: BlackRock, Capital Group, State Street, all the big investment firms, which also are going to profit from the sell-off of Ukraine's state assets. So again, war is a racket. Nothing particularly new here.